Welcome to the Unpacking Sunday podcast, where we take a deeper look at what God is speaking to you, to our church, and to the world around us. So grab a coffee, sit back, and let's unpack it together. Michael Price.
Luke Nielsen.
Here we are, back.
But we're in a new space because they are renovating that side of the church.
They've heard all about the drama from the renovations.
Yeah, when I was away, I heard it was crazy.
Yeah, so we're in your office, which is very nice.
It's nice, but actually, your new digs are pretty good, too.
Yeah, if you don't know where my office is, come to say hi sometime.
If you can find
pretty cool.
it.
Yeah, it's hidden back by the community fridge area, but it's a nice space. I'm really happy with the new space.
Well, and look at all that's happening in the church, because that area is changing a lot. The community fridge is expanding a little bit. We've got the daycare growing, and so they've moved an office into there. Yeah. We've expanded our prayer room.
Yeah, which is amazing. And we've also expanded the studio, because it's not very often a space like that. Yeah, like I feel really blessed to be in that room, so it's great.
Too blessed to be stressed.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's great. How are you? You're settled back from Thailand.
It takes a while. It takes a while, but I
post 30, you can't mess with sleep, man.
Oh my gosh! I remember. Okay, so it was right after COVID. We went to the Alpha USA conference.
Right.
It was a motley crew that we brought, but anyway, there was one person on our team. He's like 21 or something.
Okay.
And you had to like have your vax passport back then and all of this stuff.
Right.
And anyway, he had to get his vaccine in order to cross the border. And then he asked me, so the team is like me and Julia and another woman in our church who's like in her 40s and him. And he asked the team, since I can't cross the border until this certain day because of my vaccine thing, can we all just like catch a red eye from Seattle like at 1 a.m. and fly down? And I said, there's no possible way I will do that. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a reasonable flight. I'm going to eat a reasonable meal, and I'm going to go to sleep, and I'm going to wake up refreshed for the conference.
Right.
But that's what he did. So he drove from Vancouver, got to the border at midnight because he couldn't cross the border until the next day.
Oh, my word.
So at like 12:01, he crossed the border, drove to Seattle, caught a 5 a.m. flight, flew to Phoenix, landed in Phoenix, and got to the conference in time for it to start at 8:30 in the morning.
Oh, my goodness.
And was just wiped the whole day.
Yeah,
anyway, all that to say, I do feel recovered.
Good.
From Thailand. And yes, it hits you hard coming this way.
Right.
You don't really feel it going that direction.
You're jacked up from the trip. And
I don't know why. I've just heard like that direction. You don't feel jet lag as often.
Okay. Crazy.
When you're going into the future.
No, yeah. Wow.
But it is kind of weird because like I lived Friday twice.
Yeah.
Friday the 21st. I lived it twice because I left Thailand at 8:30 in the morning and I got home at 7 in the morning.
Crazy.
On Friday.
I recently heard that there's this island on the point of Alaska that is in the middle of the space in between. So the border between Europe, Russia, and the U.S. or Alaska, it borders in the middle of this island, in the middle of the water. So within a foot from each other is 24-hour difference. It's just wild. Like this
very cool.
This border crossing. Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah. That's wild.
Yeah, it is wild. Yeah. Yeah. There's a space there where a day doesn't exist. It's like, that's trippy.
That's very cool.
Twilight Zone kind of stuff. But.
And how are you, Luke?
Yeah, good. I'm good. This time of year is always hard for a person who sings, for singers, if you will, for vocalists.
Right.
I'm constantly struggling to try to find rest between getting cold symptoms and stuff like that. So I'm always blowing up my voice, but so if I sound a little raspier than normal, it's we'll get there.
What do you think about this statement that anybody can sing?
Anybody can sing?
Like someone tried to tell me.
I totally believe that any person can sing. It's just not going to be good.
Oh. Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah, you can sing for sure.
No, I do sing.
Yeah.
But you don't want to hear it. Yeah, but I just remember hearing someone say that. They're like, oh, yeah, anybody, you just got to train. And I was like, I think there's an element of talent.
I agree.
Yeah.
You see these, you know that's not true from watching shows like American Idol or The Voice, or The Voice maybe not so much because they're actual trained singers or whatever, but American Idol, you got people in there who are just singing their butts off, and they
It's no
think they're
good.
amazing, and
Yeah.
they are not.
Yeah.
So it is painful.
And it takes a good friend and kind family to
Yeah.
tell you,
Yeah,
like, stick to your gifts.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, for
So-
sure.
So here we are. We're
Yeah.
unpacking Sunday. There's lots to talk about. We were
Yeah.
just talking about different shoes. We were
Oh,
talking
yeah,
about
yeah,
that.
yeah. You were mentioning that you think you want to get a pair of Chucks or Converse.
Aren't those classic?
Oh, very classic.
Yeah.
I had an argument with my kids because I said my daughter wanted to get a pair, and I called them Chucks, and they were like, "That's not what they're called." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" They're like, "They're Converse." And I'm like, "Yes, they're Converse, but they're Chucks. They are Chucks, right?"
Yeah,
Like,
that's what we call them.
yeah, it's a basketball player. Now, of course, my mind is blanking, but it's his name, his full name. Is a basketball player from the 30s who kind of
Yeah, I don't know his name.
I can't remember. Chuck Taylor. That's what it is. So Chuck Taylor's.
Oh.
Yeah. So Chuck Taylor was a
Wow.
basketball player, and he kind of was involved with the design of these. They're actually basketball shoes. So from early on, anyways. But yeah, made popular by bands like the Ramones and whatnot in the 80s. But but here we are. So
Okay,
and
we could have,
arguing
like, a
with
history
my
lesson.
Gen Z children whether they're called Chucks or not. But
And do they wear Chucks?
my wife does. I don't know if my kids have any pairs of Chucks. I don't think so, actually. It's so funny though. Like my daughter really wanted this pair of New Balance shoes, and they're like the legit ugly dad shoes.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, you don't want those. And she's like, oh yeah, no, I want. They're
that's
so
cool.
cute.
That's cool.
And I'm like,
yeah.
are you kidding me? These are like the like dad mowing the lawn with no socks on, New Balance, and you
Wow.
want these? You wouldn't want wild to me. But anyways,
We're not cool anymore, Luke.
no, speak for yourself.
Yeah. Anyway, so let's unpack Sunday. So we are in Romans chapter 15. Pastor Jeevan was here. What stood out to you, Luke?
I'm always kind of encouraged and take a step back to look at these passages that really express the heart that Paul is trying to go for reaching the Gentiles, and how kind of a wild time that would have been for the Jewish people and for the people who for thousands of years had been expecting the Messiah. And there was talk about it, of Jesus reaching out to the Gentiles, to this other part of that weren't the chosen ones, if you will. But when it actually came down to it, there was a lot of struggle. They dealt with this real issue of this culture of Jews that just were gonna have a really hard time embracing these barbarians, if you will, spiritual barbarians, like the savages, like that. This kind of thought. So they were on a whole new frontier, and Paul really just he just lays it out in this one again about how this is what he's called to reach the Gentiles, and it's and here we are, the age of the Gentiles, 2,000 years later, and God's plan is none of them would have known that this was the plan, that the kingdom coming that Jesus talked about, as in the kingdom is near, when he was saying to the Jews, it's he was ready to bring the fulfillment of the kingdom if the Jews had accepted him. But then he hit pause so that the Gentiles could come in because they denied him. And man, am I ever so grateful that happened. So that's just such an amazing thing. I think we can so easily take it for granted, that thought of that we are included in that, the grafting in, as he's talked about. And yeah, so, and it's just a while. I had this, I was thinking about it. It's kind of funny for those of you who have had multiple children. It's you have your firstborn, which, is often no sugar, no TV till at least 2, this kind of thing.
A lot of my kids will never do that.
No, never.
Yeah. Oh,
my kids will
would
never do that.
have an
And it's
iPad.
to me, it almost feels like the Jews are kind of like God's firstborn, and the Gentiles are the youngest.
Just this
they kind
motley
of can get
middle
away with
child.
anything, kind of deal,
Yeah,
right? And I know obviously that's not true, but we are in God's grace, in a covenant of grace. So, but with that, it's just so funny when you look at the law and look at how the example that they were, the image that they were, that the need for grace and the need for Jesus's blood to cover all of our wretchedness, but to be a Gentile, it kind of feels like we're the youngest in the sense we can kind of get away with anything.
That's so
That's
funny.
that's funny image. How about you?
I think it's so funny that Paul writes, like, I'm pretty confident, like, this is what he's saying in verse 14, like, I'm pretty confident that you're full of goodness and that you know what the right thing to do is, and yet I'm writing to remind you.
Right.
And I like that he kind of says, like I've had to be hard on some of these points after he's just written like 15 chapters, like whooping our butts about us not doing it properly.
Right.
Because Romans has been like challenging at some moments.
Totally.
Right. But it's just like so classic. Like, oh, I know you're good and you're doing your best and you know what's right and you know what's wrong. But I just thought I'd remind you about these things.
Right.
Yeah, it's so funny. It's kind of like fatherly of him, right?
For sure.
And I like that, like Jeevan in his message, he reminded us, like, Paul actually had never met these people before.
Yeah, that's
like,
wild.
Like he had just heard of them.
I think you just assume that they knew that they were in like close personal relationship, and whereas they were strangers.
He never knew them.
Yeah,
when he wrote.
He never
to them.
got to know them either.
Yeah.
Right? Wow.
And so it's interesting where he's just like, oh, but this church, like, they love Jesus, but they just have this divide among them of like what this really looks like to love Jesus and like where we all came from. And so I should write something to them.
Yeah.
And so then after like reminding us of this grandness of the gospel, and like we talked about last week, like, so accept each other in light of all that Jesus has done and the way that he's made you new. And then he says to us, oh, and I'm confident like that you're full of goodness.
Yeah.
I'm confident you can do this.
Yeah.
I just wrote to you to remind you about these things.
Right.
It's so funny.
Yeah, it is funny. That's funny. I love how, just for me, this is the most in-depth study of Romans that I've been through, that I haven't. And so I think, and I'd heard I've heard pastors say or whatever, like, oh, yeah, the Romans is a really hard book. Or, oh, there's kind of this idea of it's almost being scary. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of scary, really intense, but it's like really intense concepts in Romans. But now that we've walked through it and we're coming towards the end of it, it is such a beautiful, clear description. And, how blessed are we that we can have it so clearly laid out for us through this book, that the God's heart and the grace that comes with, the righteousness that's freely given to us. I'm astounded by all the depth of wisdom that is laid out in this book for us. And it's just so fun. Yeah. For me, I think I really began to like know Paul better through this study too, which I don't know if I can say that I did before. Right. To say, you can really see his personality, you can see his father's heart, but yeah, he was very type A, as you can tell, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's kind of cool to get to know Paul through it too, right? So yeah.
And then he talks about like how important it is that we would admonish and encourage one another. Right. And because he's saying like, what's good and what's right and what's wrong. And just like in our church today, we lose sight of it because of all of our differences. And, I came from here and I do this and I practice this way and all whatever. We lose sight of what's good and right and noble. And so what a kind thing to then read like, oh, hey guys, remember, this, know this stuff. Yeah, and then he says, and it's because of the grace of God that's been given to me. That's what Paul is saying, that then I would minister the gospel to the Gentiles. What a cool thing.
Yeah.
And he talks about like being this like priestly minister to the Gentiles who would also now like be part of this royal priesthood of all believers. Right.
Right.
But like Paul had this obligation similar to how we have one to another, to minister the gospel to other ministers of the gospel.
Right.
And like, what a privilege that is, right? For me to remember, okay, I know what's good and right despite my differences. And so how might I too admonish other people in my midst by ministering the gospel to them, even though they already know it.
Yeah.
And even though we're already part of the body, right? And it's not about like teaching people or telling them what to do, But it's just like a sweet thing that he would say, like, because of the grace of God, that I would minister this thing to people who actually already know it and have already received it. And to me, that's like a great reminder of how we need to, I think Jeevan used the word affirm a lot. And we need to affirm and encourage one another. And like, I think also call out what we see God doing in people's lives. It's easy for us to like get hung up on, like I said, our differences or the things we don't like about each other or the way that people aren't living it properly. And there's a time and space for that, especially as fellow believers. We are called to hold each other to account. But Jeevan said like a big thing was like affirming one another gives us that space and permission to like instruct one another. Yeah. Right. And I think that's a profound thing. So even in your life, like where have you seen that? Like where people have, and it's not flattery. I'm not talking about flattery. I'm talking about where have you seen people call out maybe what God's doing and the goodness of God in your life, and that has created change or caused you to be instructed by the Lord.
Yeah, I'm thinking of one major moment that was very impactful for me. But before I even talk about that, I just am thinking like it's hard and it's a little sad almost. I wonder if this kind of admonishing, there's been like a decline with the decline of the written word of the, just because I can remember having these impactful moments where, like there were handwritten letters for me, the most important moment where I was really struggling as a teenager and I'd kind of was hanging out with the wrong crowd and had gotten involved in, just kind of dabbling and experimenting with worldly things, drinking and a little bit of drugs, whatever, in my teen years. And through this whole season of life, I was a Christian, but was just kind of finding myself distant, becoming more and more distant from Jesus. And I received a letter from my sister who was in the missions field in Mexico. And she just called it out of me. And in this letter, and I can just remember how impactful it was that she didn't write about disappointment. She didn't write about, she called the goodness. She called the promises that God had spoken over me and then the obvious call that God had in my life in this letter. And I can remember it was a breaking moment where I recommitted my life to Jesus in that moment. And it's it wasn't at the front of a church service. It was just from this letter that it was written to me from my sister. And yeah, I can remember that was a pivotal time in me where I received this letter from my sister, and it changed the trajectory of my future. So from there, and I was able to really step into, cut out the things that were distracting me to get to the things that God was calling me to. So, yeah.
Yeah. And it reminds me, it's as we pursue Christ and our eyes are fixed upon him, that then these other things in our life sort of fade away.
Yeah.
And, there are spiritual disciplines that we can do. There are all these things we can do, but it's with our eyes fixed upon Jesus. And otherwise it's you're never going to walk where God wants you to walk, or in your situation, experience this call that God had on your life, right? And so it's so much more about helping people to reorient where they cast their gaze, right? And it's it's easy for me to, even as a leader and as someone who oversees a team, it's easy to say this person needs to fix this and this and this and this. It's easy to point out all that's wrong in people's lives. That doesn't motivate anybody to do anything.
Well, yeah.
What is the most beautiful thing you could do for someone is to say, hey, this is what I see God doing, or this is what I know God has called you to.
Right.
Let's focus on that and let's pursue that together.
Right.
And there's things along the way that we'll have to fix and cut away work on. But that's so much more motivating. And so I love that's what Paul says. He's you guys know these things already. So instead of the Jews nitpicking the Gentiles for all the things they're not doing, and instead of the Gentiles thinking the Jews are these stuck up people who think they have it all together, imagine we just all turned our attention to this good work of Jesus.
For sure.
Right? And we began to just, like he says, minister the gospel to one another.
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, Luke, remember how God did this thing in your life?
Right.
And remember how he called you here. What if we did this?
Yeah, I think it's so inspiring to see how Paul went there in this, how he called the goodness out of them. He could have easily and had the right to say, how dare you do this? And how, and in reminder, please stop doing this. Please stop doing this. And I think it's so applicable to us as believers, especially as parents. Like, if we reflect on our own, like, for example, this whole situation with me, when I turned it around from this letter from my sister and I was able to be inspired, she was calling the goodness out of me. And it's like, yeah, in these situations, it's so easy to, especially with my own kids, to come down on them and to nitpick or to be a critic instead of a coach, if you will, right? And so I think I'm going to walk away from this conversation remembering that, saying, I'm going to work on calling the goodness out of my kids and reminding them, hey, you are a wonderful person, and I love you, and this is not who you are, as opposed to this idea of like, stop doing this or stop doing that or stop doing this. And I think there's something really important there that we can take away from this, that Paul decided to go there intentionally at the end of Romans to remind the Roman church that they were filled with these good things of God and they were called to more. And I love that.
And it reminds me, like, there's a book. Maybe we can tag it. I don't know how that works, like in the description of this.
I can try.
Yeah, it's called, we've read it together, Celebration of Discipline, Richard Foster.
Oh, yes.
But he talks about in that book, you are always being formed or deformed by something all the time.
Yeah.
Right? And so we have to be careful, even for ourselves, like we were saying, like where our gaze is cast, what we're looking at, what we're drawing out of people. And, if we're not like allowing the gospel to minister to us and all that Jesus has done, because everything in Romans, like it's said 100 times, not actually 100, I haven't counted, but a ton of times, like in view of God's mercy, because of what God has done. If we're not ministering that to ourselves and to one another all the time, we are actually, I would say, moving away from Jesus. There isn't neutral. There's no neutral zone.
That's so true.
Right? You're either moving toward Jesus or you're moving away from him.
Right.
And so, like, what can we do to admonish and encourage that in one another? And maybe that would even be something we could ask to the church. Like, I was working with the intensive this week, and I just gave them this challenge to celebrate something that God has done in your life recently, but celebrate it, because we were talking about the discipline of celebration.
Right.
So I wonder, in light of even what Jeevan preached on Sunday and what Paul is saying, is that if the people here would do even what you're saying you're going to do with your kids, pick somebody where you see God moving in their life, and maybe they don't see it, or maybe they do, doesn't matter. And would you minister to that person based on that, like based on the goodness that you see God working out in their life? Would you minister the gospel to them? Would you help them call it out in one another and affirm what God is doing? And watch, like what you said with the letter from your sister, watch how that transforms the trajectory of their life or the situation that they find themselves in.
Wow.
And so I would challenge us to do that one to another this week, if we're listening. If there was a challenge, if I'm allowed to give one.
Yeah, you are
on the podcast. So
some homework.
There's your homework.
Yeah, love it.
Luke, that's your homework too.
Okay.
All
right. Well, church, we love you. We'll be back next week.
See you next week.
Unpacking Sunday is a podcast of Cariboo Road Christian Fellowship Church. If you're interested in more information, please check out our website at www.crcfchurch.com.